5 minutes, I will consider for attendance. Okay. So any questions with respect to the previous session? Case study method? Clear, right? When you need to choose the case study methods, when you go with the qualitative analysis of research, right? Now, this is one of the very important subtitle for the data collection, and this is the last step in the research work, that is report writing. So previous to the report writing, let us understand what is interpretation. So it is the word is self-explanatory. The interpretation means, so whatever you've done so far in your research process, you are required to observe the in detail, and you are required to maintain the link between the process from beginning to till end. So that's the it is nothing but interpretation. Interpretation of two types. One is the logical interpretation. The another one is chronological interpretation. In the logical interpretation cases, it needs the logical technical details. You are more about concerning about the technical details, connection between the topic to topic, from step phases to phases. Whereas the chronological sequence, based on the timeline, when you done that work, based on the timeline, you are going to give the interpretation. So a little later we will look into both kind of the interpretations. First, let us understand what exactly the interpretation is. So once the data is collected and you've done some applying some statistical methods to analyze the data, after such things happen, the researcher has to accomplish the task of drawing inferences, followed by report writing. Report writing is the last step for this research course. Okay. So what is interpretation? Interpretation that the researcher can expose relations and processes that underlie his findings. So so maybe if you started not started already, if you are completing your research work by conducting the experimentation, by applying the statistics method for data, and refining the study by applying the treatment methods, etc., and so on. So the last stage of your research process is you require to interpret whatever you've done so far. You need to provide the relationship between the variables which you identified in the beginning of your research. You need to align all the processes work carried out so far from beginning to till end of the research, that which it will comes under the interpretation kind. Suppose in case of these hypothesis testing studies, if you are well defining in very well in advance, if you are defining providing the assumption, later you need to either prove or disprove your assumption what you made in the beginning. If hypotheses are tested and upheld several times, the researcher may arrive at generalization. Suppose if you are a new researcher now, so first time you are learning about the research process. So you identified a area of your interest and you defined the problem statement. After defining the problem statement, you are given some hypothesis and some data collection method you chosen. After doing all those such things, So suppose if you are completing the research work today, tomorrow your down the line your junior is going to take up this course. In that case, again junior is going to refer your reports, what our seniors was done in previous year. They are going to re-implement the same and taken up as their work. If the people who is doing the same repeated research implementation, so finally that research work can be generalized. Usually, so more than 3 to 4 times, if the same work is going to implement by the different researchers, that work can come to the down of the generalizations. But in case the researcher had no hypothesis to start with, in the case of exploratory research, in the exploratory research, usually you are not defining well in advance the hypothesis. In that cases, if you don't have the hypothesis, then what you require to explain your findings on the basis of some theory. Some reference theory you require to pull down and explain whatever you've done so far in your research. In the exploratory research, whatever you've done, descriptive research, you can keep on explaining based on some certain theories. This may at times result in new questions leading to further research. In the case of this, where the research which does not have hypothesis, it needs the explanation of their findings. There is a possibility of throwing the new questions to the new researcher. So, and it leads to further researches. Suppose suppose if I ask a question in the internal test. Suppose if I ask a question, write the description about the exploratory work to be carried out about the teaching learning process. In the teaching learning process, what experimental you can do? Usually, that is a descriptive approach. So in teaching learning, if we can have a technical softwares, etc., so and so you are going to define, right? So interactive is good, like that you are defining. So one another person, he will read your report, and he may get an idea such that suppose if I would include this in the TLP research process, it become my work. So there is a possibility of, in the exploratory research, there is a possibility of throwing the new one or the many questions to the new researcher to carry out the further research work, right? This is the another meaning of the interpretation. All this analytical information and consequential inferences. So there is a possibility of drawing a one conclusion or multiple results. In that case, preferably through research report to the consumers of research results, who may be either an individual or a group, or individuals or some public or private organization. All these things, see, with the help of the interpretation, how you are interpreting as a researcher, you are the owner for your entire research process. Whatever you defining, whatever you are drawing the inferences and the conclusion on the results, you are the ultimate responsibility to reach to the other reader in this research process. Okay, any question on interpretation? Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Fine.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So, meaning of interpretation. So, if possible, you can have a snapshot of it, or you can write some definitions using pen and paper. That is useful rather than having screenshots. Also, it avoids the sleeping mode of you. If you start writing, okay, it will create interest on you on this topic. Interpretation refers to the task of drawing inferences from the collected facts after an analytical or an experimental study. As interpretation does, you are drawing inferences. You are drawing the possibilities. The what you set the objectives in the beginning, proposed system will do so and so. Such drawing results analysis you are going to do here with the help of the interpretation process. It is a process. It is not just a method, it is a process. In fact, suppose it is a research for broader meaning of research findings. The task of interpretation has two major aspects. Yes, yes. Any question? Clear. Okay, fine. You can put your questions in the chat window. I'll answer for that. Okay, later. If you want to ask the questions. The task of interpretation has two major aspects. The one is the effort to establish continuity in research through linking the results of a given study with those of another. It means that in the interpretation process, here there is a comparative study happens. So for example, take the example of traffic analysis. Suppose Raman has taken up that traffic analysis. Another student has taken the same traffic analysis. I think one girl and one boy in our class. So their analysis methods, adapted data collection methods, and the topic of interest, the result which they are going to draw might be same or different. If it is same, we need to compare those two. So we need to compare. When you do comparison, which one is better? Who has done a good work? Comparison usually happens with the same kind of work, not for distinct works. You can compare. No. So the similar kind of work carried out by researchers to compare the improvement in their work or the significant improvements in their research work. You can compare. So in the interpretation portion, you are going to establish a continuity in research through the linking the results of a given study with those of another. The second major aspect of that interpretation is establishment of some explanatory concepts. So it is not always to draw the results from the interpretation. Sometimes because every research is not a similar research. Every research will not end up with only the mathematical kind of statements or problem solving. Every research is not end up with just description. All the research in this world is a unique research. So to establish there is a possibility of some explanatory of concepts are needed during the interpretation of the interpretation time. So in one sense, interpretation is concerned with this is important concept in the external examination. There is a possibility of 2 questions from the report writing itself. Okay. Interpretation is concerned with relationship within the collected data, partially overlapping analysis. This is very interesting. Interpretation is concerned with relationships within the collected data. Where you can do the relationship. So when you define the variables which you identified in the research process, and with respect to the variables you have collected some data, you are trying to build the relationship among the data set which you have used in your research process. Then sometimes you are partially overlapping analysis. Some group of, for example, if we do the research on student behavior pattern, some students, one group of students are mild in nature, another group of students arrogant in nature. So some students, they may be both kind of the students. In that case, there is a overlap between the, some students might be overlap between the arrogant as well as the mild students. Okay, to such thing, to identify any overlap sampling of data is present, in that cases you are going with the overlapping analysis. So interpretation also extends behind the data of the study to include the results of other research, theory and hypothesis. While interpretation, you should be very careful about the extraneous variable which is not visible directly to the researcher. It may exist because of their impact on research deviation and bias will happen. So while interpretation, you must be, as a researcher, you must be very careful in interpreting such kind of variables also. So in other words, we can say interpretation is the device through which the factors that seem to explain what has been observed by the researcher in the course of the study can be better understood, and it also provides a theoretical conception which can serve as a guide for further researchers. Right, interpretation, the main purpose of interpretation is the researcher needs to be very clearly understood about his problem of the research process, and also not only his understanding, he or she should make the understanding his or her research work to the other readers of the other readers. So now we understood that what is the meaning of research. Now we are going to know about why interpretation. Uh, what is the requirement of interpretation in the research process? What is the reason? Very simple reason, that usefulness and utility of research findings lie in the proper interpretation. This is very interesting, common usefulness of the interpretation. Why interpretation is necessary? Simple reason is that usefulness and utility of research findings lie in the proper interpretation. For example, if the student has developed the traffic analysis, if he has developed a solution for that, suppose he developed for the solution for the traffic analysis for the roads. Suppose the reader may misinterpret, he is trying to implement that research work carried out by the researcher on the airway traffic. So in that cases, that research may not suit or fit for the airline traffic analysis. So by interpreting properly, you are able to understand the research, actually the boundary and scope of the research carried out by the researcher. It is being considered a basic component of research process because of the following. The following reasons are applied on why we need have the interpretation in the research process. The first one research process reason is, it is through interpretation that the researcher can well understand the abstract principle that works beneath this finding. For example, you can take of polymorphism. So you can take off inheritance concept. Suppose the researcher has done that some research work on the inheritance concept, that is object orientation concept. Exactly, if you look into the nature, how the nature implements the inheritance concept, how the nature implements the abstract concept, how the nature implements the polymorphic concept. So the ultimate achievement of the research for the researcher is gaining the knowledge of abstract principle that is led by the nature. So when you are carrying out the research, not only providing a solution for the research, in addition to that, you are going to master or clear in the in the abstract principles of the nature works. So if you look into the tree, so if you look into the car, vehicle, some mechanism is abstract, means hidden from the user, right? Rotation of the gears, etc., and it's hidden. So it is not directly accessible. It is accessible through the clutches and the accelerator or the brake system, right? So access method, all those is if you are looking car as a simple object, you will not come to know in detail about the car. When you started researching about the car and which are the theories are applied on to build up that car, etc., and so on, you are going to learn in detail and natural fact how they are implemented, etc. All those things you are going to gain through this. The researcher can link up his findings with those of other studies. So one has built the car. So again, he is going to compare with the other cars who has already built up and trying to tell that my car features is more far better than the other car features. Right. So it's a car is here the research process. It's having the same abstract principle and thereby can predict about the concrete world of events. In this work, if you look into outside the world, it is looking like a concrete world. So if you started understanding that the nature of this world, you will come to know the lot of objective orientation concepts are involved to build up any of the objects in this world, right? And fresh inquiries can test these prediction later on. Suppose the down the line your juniors are take up this course. In that case, they will start and querying about your research. So what our seniors is done is right. They are not telling right or wrong because they are new researcher. They can ask more question. How you did this work? What was the motive behind this? What are the sample data collection you made, etc., and so on. They can ask. They can ask the fresh inquiry about your research. In this way, the continuity in research can be maintained. So research is not just a one-time process; it is a lifetime process for an individual or the group or the organizations. So if you are living the research, means the research won't stop anywhere. It still continue from the next generations, right? This is the one research process reason why we need have the interpretation. Interpretation provides the meaningful result analysis for your research findings. So that if you are comparing with another researcher, it is going to provide the insight in details of that research work, and also it encourages the new researcher to inquiry about the research being carried out by the earlier researcher, and that new fresh researcher will continue his research work. So to maintain the continuity between the previous work and the current work and the future work, the interpretation helps in that direction. Then the second reason for the interpretation, why we need interpretation. Interpretation leads to the establishment of explanatory concepts that can serve as a guide for future research studies. See, when you start interpreting, because whatever you do in the research process, everything it start coming from your mind. When it comes out of your mind, that will in the form of implementation. So whatever you had the idea in the beginning, abstract idea, you made that to the reality. Then how the other people is going to understand your work when you started writing the report, whatever you done so far, the experimentation or any explanation, explanatory concepts, or if any explanatory descriptive studies, whatever you made, if you are representing everything in the form of writings, in the form of statements, then that help the new guys, new base who is going, who wants, who have their interest in their research. Definitely they will take up your work as a literature review. So it opens new avenues of intellectual adventure and stimulates the quest for more knowledge. Interpretation also, the reason of using interpretation leads to establishment, as well as it opens up the new channels, new path for what for intellectual in knowledge growing, and also it stimulates the quest for more knowledge. So you started asking more and more question on a particular topic of interest, then you started digging the knowledge, then so somehow you are compared to the others in this world, you become a little more skilled, knowledgeable person compared to the other researchers. There's the another reason for interpretation. The third reason for the interpretation is that researcher can better appreciate only through interpretation why these findings are what they are, and can make others to understand the real significance of his research findings. This is the another third reason is that better appreciate. When you compare, suppose for example, in our college itself, we have the several faculty here. So one is doing pursuing PhD, another is already completed. So the who is going to be get more appreciate or the respect, the person who has done the doctoral degree already. So through this interpretation, and also what is the meaning actually, done in, completed means meaning is they have accomplished the task in their research area of interest, right? It is not comparable because individual research is different, their interest, their topic, their methodology, their collection, their interpretation, implement, everything is maybe somehow it is connected somewhere, but the process and the steps are might be different. Okay, this is the third reason of interpretation. The fourth reason of interpretation is that findings of exploratory research study often results into hypothesis for experimental research, and as such interpretation is involved in transition from exploratory to experimental research. Always there is a transitional phase between the research process from one research one researcher to another researcher. In the interpretation stage, findings of exploratory research often results into hypothesis. Sometimes when you started finding, sometimes it is not always true, sometimes when you started explaining about a particular work in the research, you are able to identify the variables that is going to affect on your exploratory study. Then what you are going to take up is you are converting that variables to the mathematical model. That is mathematical model again, it is able to derive the hypothesis for that mathematical model. From that mathematical model, once if you are able to identify the mathematical model, obviously you can perform the experiment on that mathematical model by providing the input and getting the output. You can do analysis, etc., and so on. So vice versa, it is also possible with the help of the interpretation. And since an exploratory study does not have a hypothesis, in case of exploratory study, if it does not have the hypothesis, then how you are going to interpret the whatever you are interpreting, you are finding, it is also termed as post factum. Please note about the post factum. The post factum is the term of interpretation when you are trying to fetch or interpret your finding in the research study of exploratory research study, then that is termed as the post factum. That is termed as the post factum. Okay. These are the four different reasons of why we need to do the interpretation. Then, so technique of interpretation. First, we understood what is interpretation, meaning of the interpretation, why we needed the interpretation. Now, we are going to learn technique of interpretation and significance. Right? Technique of interpretation. The task of interpretation is not an easy job. Why? In the textbook it is told that it is not easy. Why? Because when when you are able to do it very easy, that when you have a already depth knowledge, wider knowledge of about the research work and little experience of the research is needed. The fresh view of the researcher cannot do it very immediately, because interpretation, if you are doing bias in the interpretation, it will end up with some other result. Because you need to establish a connection between the variable to variable, process to process, and you are also you require to compare your findings with the another work of the finding of the same research work. If you are able to fail anywhere in between to do this task, then your research interpretation will end up with something else. So rather it requires a great skill and dexterity on the part of the researcher. So interpretation is an art that one learns through practice and experience. This is very important. At one time it won't come. That's why supervisors are required, why the guides are required in the research process. This is the one reason, that because already they went through this process of interpretation, probably they are the suitable to us to guide about how we can do the interpretation to derive it and to come to the conclusion of the research work. That's the researcher may at times seek the guidance from experts for accomplishing the task of interpretation. Since the interpretation is an art, because of that art, yes, drawing is also art, but it won't come for everyone. Good drawing, bad drawings will be there. Similarly, research interpretation is an also art. It needs a continuous regular practice and experience to get the proper interpretation of your research work done so far. And this technique of interpretation involves the following step. Step 1, researcher must give reasonable explanations of the relations which he has found and must interpret the lines of relationship in terms of underlying processes, and must try to find out the thread of uniformity that lies under the surface layer of his diversified research findings. This is interesting. So even though if you are carry out the same research, one research, there is a possibility of multiple findings from your research work. When you are in the middle of carry out the research, you may find some useful content might helpful for your research work. So in that cases, you need to have to give the explanation about the relations which it is involved between those diversified research findings. In fact, this this is the technique of how generalization should be done. and concepts be formulated. E equal to mc square. So how it has done? Generalized statement is given, because if other researcher, if they started working on that formula, again they will end up, they are trying to make it is wrong statement, means the initial hypothesis they are trying to say that E equal to mc square is the wrong. So then they will end up with, yes, what I was made, my hypothesis is wrong. So the actual is E equal to mc square is right. So in this way, several researchers might done their research, and they will come to the conclusion that E equal to mc square is the generalization formula, and this is the concept of energy, right? The second technique of interpretation is extraneous information. As I said that in the interpretation process, if any extraneous variable which is not visible to you directly to interpret, if in the while interpreting such kind of extraneous information, you must be very careful to consider them in your research study. So, extraneous information, if collected during the study, must be considered while interpreting the final results of research study, for it may prove to be a key factor in understanding the problem under consideration. So, extraneous information, if you collected in during your research study process, then interpreting, while interpretation also you should be considered. Otherwise, you can give up that extraneous information. By give up, it should not deviate your research objective, right? Okay. This is the second technique. One is what? The research reasonable explanations for diversified research finding. The second one is extraneous information to be considered if you are including them in during the research study. The third is final interpretation. The third is final interpretation. Final interpretation to consult someone having insight into the study and who is frank and honest and will not hesitate to point out omissions and errors in logical argumentation. So during the interpretation, you may find some of the parameters which you consider during the study process. You may omit them. Before omitting them from your work, you need to give the explanation why you are give up such kind of the parameters now at the last moment. So you need to provide a honest work whatever you done in your research process. Such a consultation will result in correct interpretation, will enhance the utility of research results. In the final interpretation, what is required? Frank and honest feedback is honest agreements are required from the researcher about any omissions or errors introduced, or the deletions or new variables are adding, etc., and so on. The fourth technique of interpretation is researcher must accomplish the task of interpretation only after considering all relevant factors affecting the problem to avoid false generalization. So as I said, the interpretation task, you need to be consider all the factors that is going to affect on the problem which you identified. If you miss out any of the parameters you identified, variables you identified, any of the confounded relationships, such kind of the things, if you are omit them, you are going to give the false generalization. You cannot come up with the conclusion of the generalization stage, right? So the researcher must be in no hurry while interpreting results. You should not go with hurry. I want to submit the report. Because of that reason, in a hurry mode, don't trying to give the interpreting the result. Take up your own time to interpret the results, and based on your interpretation, try to write the article or the research report. Then submit to the higher ups. Okay, this is the four different reasons. Here, researcher must accomplish the task of interpretation. So here, no hurry is the technique of interpretation. So don't be urgent in submitting the reports. During the interpretation, you should be very calm and be patient. You require to consider all parameters and all which it is affecting on your problem statement. Okay, so with this, I'll stop today the discussion about the interpretation. In the next class, I'm going to discuss about precaution of interpretation. During the interpretation process, what all the preliminary measurements we should take care as a precautional things. Okay, we'll discuss this in the next class. Any questions?
No, sir.
No. Understood, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. What is the next class? Which is the next class? Any class is there?
No, sir.
Okay. You want to me continue?
No, sir.
No, sir.
Okay. Thank you.
Sir, attendance.
Yes, yes. Yes, any question?
Sir, attendance.
Attendance I'm
Attendance
taking
is
from
done.
chat window. In the chat window you enter, right?
Yes, sir. We have one.
Through that I will take. Don't enter twice, only enter one time. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.